Hello, everybody. Welcome to our Women's Leadership Series, which we've called 5 Questions for 5 Leaders. I'm delighted to have you here with us, and I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of all the different lands on which we're on and pay my respects to our elders past, present and emerging, and note that their lands have never been ceded. Today, I am so happy to welcome Dr Rhonda Galbally. Rhonda, welcome and thanks for joining us on 5 Questions for 5 Women.
Thank you, Louise. It's great to be here.
Thank you. I've known Rhonda for a very long time, and if I think back over her career, she has been a woman who has chaired things, been a board member, been a very committed person to the work that she does, and I thought it would be terrific to get some of her insights on leadership. She's an author too, and she wrote this book, Just Passions, The Personal is Political, and I'd encourage you to grab it and get a read. Is it still available, Rhonda? Can people still pick it up?
It's out of print, but I put it up on Amazon for free. So, you know, when it ran out of its second print run. So,
so specifically, Rhonda's was the founding CEO of Vic Health. She's also, of course, been with the NDIA in its formative years as both a board member and, very importantly, as the leader of the advisory committee as part of that process. She's, as I said, a writer, a commissioner at the Disability Royal Commission currently, and we are delighted to hear from you, Rhonda. So thanks once again. So we thought we might just start with a general question, and that's really about telling us a bit about yourself, what motivates you, perhaps in some of your personal priorities.
Well, I think that probably my motivation started when I was a really little child, a baby, when I contracted polio. And, you know, having a disability and that incredible disruption of being taken away in the middle of the night to an infectious diseases hospital and staying there on and off for 3 years, it had a huge impact on me. And somehow I think it really turned me into a fighter, because you'd either fight or you'd sink, you know.
Yes.
It was really one thing or the other.
Yeah.
So that was a very big part of my early life.
Yes.
It certainly led me to be who I am.
Yes, yeah. And what was your family like at that time? Can you just tell us perhaps a bit
Well,
about your mother or your...
Yeah, it was a sort of, I had a brother, sadly he died, and, you know, I think he went through that terrible sadness of, you know, when the second child's born, the first one often wishes they'd sort of go to hell, and I sort of did. So I think that had a big impact on him.
Yes. And
he struggled, and, you know, it really was a big blow to my family, and, you know, my mum struggled, and yeah, so it was never the same family.
And polio was, well, it was a particular period of time, wasn't it? And originally there was not a lot known about polio. I think that developed over that period, didn't it?
Well, it was a huge thing then. There was a lot similar to the early days of HIV.
Yes.
You know, in the prejudice and discrimination. And my father tells the story of going down to the local telephone box to ring up to see if I was alive. And they took Dettol, the neighbour took Dettol and made him disinfect the telephone box. And, you know, the neighbours wouldn't let them in. And, you know, terrible discrimination and cruelty, really, that was all based on fear, which is, you know, so the COVID epidemic, you know, it just... And then I've heard that there's polio in the sewage system in the UK. So, you know, we hope it's eradicated, but it isn't necessarily.
A lot to think about there, and a lot to remember in the context of COVID. I think you're quite right. Can you tell us a little bit about why you're a leader, do you think, and a bit about your journey for being a leader?
Well, I think it was starting with disability that, you know, I came out an outsider out of hospital because I was no longer in the family group. And outsiders are often leaders, I think, because if you're not in the group. And then there was such a lot that created a sense. My leadership is definitely about justice and social justice. There's no doubt about it. And I think disability started it. Then a very feminist mother, you know, for that day. You know, we had.
Can I be a bit wicked and ask what period are we talking about when you, just to get
Oh, well,
of your
you know, probably the whole time. She worked and loved work. Yeah. She was an absolute basket case when she took a year off. You know, she didn't like being at home. And I learned about a woman who was better off working and loved her work. And that was, and then, but also she had all feminist books on the bookshelf. So when I wagged it or stayed home, I used to read them. And I realised, you know, there was terrible injustice for women, you know, and that was very big. Yeah.
It's really interesting. What makes a strong leader, do you think?
Well, interestingly, I think it's probably being able to be soft. I think there's a tremendous, that's my view. I think there's a tremendous misunderstanding that a strong leader has to be a tough, you know, cruel. I think there's a lot of cruelty in leadership. And, you know, uncontained. I think, you know, people shouting and yelling, you know, all of that to me is not a strong leader. It's a really weak leader and probably somebody who shouldn't be a leader, really. But a strong leader is being able to feel and take note of your feelings, but not necessarily act on them, but know them. So I think it's about insight and knowing yourself enough to be contained. And I can remember a leader, actually I'll name her, her name's Andrea Hull. This was in the 80s when I'd first started to be CEO of organisations. And she said to me, you know, somebody who's a leader should never scream and shout at others, because what can they do about it? If you've got all the power, like it's an incredibly inappropriate thing to do. And I really thought about that. I thought that was really valuable, Andrea saying that to me, because it is true. You know, if you're a leader, there's certain ways you have to behave, I think, towards others, and probably feel that compassion. But on the other hand, you know, I think leaders have to have values too. So I think leadership without values, and I think there's a misunderstanding that leadership is management, and it isn't. And I don't think leadership's climbing a ladder either to the top. I think that, you know, there's a leadership that needs to be all the way through organisations and communities, not just, you know, this view that you have to be at the top.
I think the point about listening, you know, sort of being with people and listening and actually really hearing what people are, you know, attending to what people are saying. And I do feel also that the respect piece, and I think you're encompassing that in, you know, talk about what your behaviours like with others is such a key part as well.
Yes, and I don't want to suggest that I'm a paragon of virtue. I can remember...
I know you're not a paragon of virtue.
I can remember at Big Health, you know, which was very stressful. That was a very stressful job in the early, especially in the early years.
Yes.
Because we were picked on by everybody, the tobacco companies, the alcohol industry, you know, a lot of... so I can remember I knew, they didn't know I knew, but I knew I was called Madam Lash, which I don't feel, because I was so exacting and demanding. And I think that's inappropriate. You know, I had to learn my lesson about that.
Yes.
I brought a group of psychodynamic work consultants in from the Tavistock Institute. And when they told me how staff felt about coming to a management meeting, you know, that they were actually really anxious, I wept and felt like I'd broken that edict when Andrea said, you know, because there's more than one way to do it.
Yeah.
Shouting's one way, but being exacting and demanding and never happy, never satisfied, that's another way. So I sort of had to go and lick my wounds and change.
Growth.
Change. I hope I changed.
Yeah. You touched before on values and the importance of values in leadership. What about purpose?
Yes, well, you've taken me aback. I'm not sure that I know the answer. But, you know, I just sort of, I find everyone being in love with leadership, you know, really offends me a bit because, you know, if you've got leadership, well, for me, for no values, and I'm very judgmental about that because I think values need to be about justice, you know, and so, you know, it just sort of leaves me really cold, and it sort of frightens me because, you know, Donald Trump was a leader and Hitler was a leader. So we've got to be careful what we're aspiring to. I think, and you know, if it's personal, sort of wanting to get to the next level, there's nothing wrong with that. And you know, the trouble with the view of women is that we're not allowed to want that. On the other hand, if that's all we want, and if all we're doing is networking to get those opportunities, then I think that's a real pity, and to me isn't leadership really.
That's really helpful. Do you think women lead differently, moving on to that sort of area of women in leadership?
Well, I think women could lead differently if they really embraced being a woman. I think the trouble is that so-called masculine attributes become what women take on. And they sort of learn those often in leadership courses and in MBAs and all over the place, you know, with really important exceptions, like Amanda Sinclair. I'm reminded of her and the wonderful work she's done on leadership. And she would be saying all of these things, by the way. So I should acknowledge her. She's really...
She looked at women in government a lot, didn't she? And the local government. And she wrote Counting the Numbers, I think, Counting the Numbers.
Yes,
yes.
Exactly. And she sort of takes a much more psychodynamic approach to leadership, which means she's looking for the music under the words and wanting to hold on to a notion of leadership that embraces, you know, compassionate qualities. And so in that sense, it's not all MBA people.
No, exactly. And sort of, I suppose, just to wrap up at the end, as a leader, if there was one thing, if you looked at the world at the minute and there was one thing you would like to see, what would that be? And you would like to contribute to, what would that be?
Well, without sounding corny or one thing that's many things would be that issues like racism and, you know, I came across, you know, the whole First Nations issues in the early 80s, you know, when I met Shane Houston at NACHO, and, you know, so that's incredibly important. And sexism, obviously, homophobia, ableism. So to get rid of the egregious discrimination and exclusion, you know, absolute exclusion that some people aren't human enough to have in the society. And then the second thing, so you asked about one, but I'm putting in...
You're going to give me two.
And I'm speaking to myself, you know, as much as anybody, would be to really challenge greed, because greed's at the basis of climate change, you know, of everything that's going wrong in the world. It's when's enough, you know, and how can we ever think that our lives are good enough where we're not going to consume the things we're consuming, you know, that are miles, and enough being enough brings up the issue of inequality too,
Mm-hmm.
and the terrible inequities with the growth, of the disparities. So there's 3 things that I would change with leadership, that all need leadership.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Rhonda, for giving us your time today. And it's been great to hear your thoughts and some of the challenges in there that you've clearly left us with. And thank you all for joining us as well. And we'll see you hopefully next time on 5 Questions for 5 Leaders. Thank you so much, Rhonda.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.